Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 52 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Boston Bruins, in which the Sharks have lost 3-1. So after that hard-fought victory a couple of days ago against the New York Islanders that ended up going to a shootout, the Sharks end up right back into the losing column today. But that's not necessarily that much of a surprise. The Boston Bruins are one of the better teams in the NHL, a playoff team with some very strong underlying stats, one of the best even strength teams defensively in the entire league, and that was on full display here tonight, because while the Sharks did manage to score a goal, that one coming on a power play from Timo Meier, when it came to even strength, the Sharks were just absolutely manhandled by the much stronger Boston Bruins squad. And so this game ended up looking rather close. It was a 2-1 game until the last 40 seconds, where the Bruins ended up making it 3-1, but it's really only the scoreboard that looked super close. By just how the game actually went, by how the play was, it was pretty heavily Boston favored. But moving on into the game, in the first period, it would be the Bruins to score the first goal. That one would come from Marchand to make it 1-0. And unlike in the previous two games, the Sharks would not be able to score two goals in response to that to have a 2-1 lead going into the second period. Instead, they have the 1-0 deficit going into the second period. But in that second period, the Sharks would actually score the game-tying goal coming from Timo Meier on the Sharks power play, which I'll actually take a moment to talk about right now. The power play has been rather hot for the San Jose Sharks over their past few games. I believe the stat was 9 power play goals over their last 9 games. And you could be asking the question of what exactly the Sharks are doing right now compared to what they were doing before that was wrong. And honestly, I wouldn't say necessarily much has changed. I feel as though there's just been a bit more luck on the side of the San Jose Sharks, as if you just look at some of the goals that they have been scoring here tonight, just looking at this one, this is a Timo Meier one-timer that the Bruins goaltender probably should have had, but it somehow managed to sneak through his 5-hole. But basically 20 games ago, the point is that those were shots that were being saved. And so of these 9 goals, I'd say a good half of them were probably ones that the goaltenders making or having to make those saves would have liked to have back. Barabanov one a couple of games ago also comes to mind. And so generally, I don't think the Sharks are doing a ton different. They're just kind of shooting pucks on net, and they're getting some seeing eye shots that happen to be going in. I suspect we will not, it's pretty obvious we're not going to see this hot streak continue over these last 30 games, but I suspect it'll probably end up middling out. Probably won't be as bad as it was 20 to 30 games ago, or how it had been for about 20 to 30 games for most of this season, but it's certainly not going to be as good as it has been over these past 10 or so games either. And moving on into the third period, this is where the Bruins relatively early on would be able to take the lead 2-1 for themselves off of a Brad Marchand goal. And for the first half of this period, the San Jose Sharks couldn't even manage a single shot, just to show the Bruins' absolute dominance at even strength. The Sharks were the trailing team. Usually score effects come into play at that point, and yet that was not the case, at least until the last half of the third period, where the Sharks managed to start picking some nice individual plays from the likes of Tomas Hertl, Timo Meier, Brent Burns, and Ryan Merkley to attempt to get the Sharks into this game to tie it up, but it would not end up being the case. And when we would see at the last couple of minutes of this third period, the Sharks would be unable to even attempt pulling James Reimer. The Bruins would keep it hemmed into the Sharks' own zone or in the neutral zone, and eventually Patrice Bergeron would put the game away with a goal to make it 3-1, and that would be our final score. On to the things to talk about. The fact is that the Sharks were just systematically outplayed here tonight. There's not really much else to say about that, and so most of the strong players or strong performances this game come from individual efforts and not necessarily a full 5-man cohesive unit on the ice for the San Jose Sharks. And so, like I mentioned just a bit earlier, that's players like Timo Meier, who had a couple of very nice plays for himself, Tomas Hertl, who had a couple of very nice plays for himself as well. So that was obviously not that much of a surprise to see. They are constantly a force to be reckoned with for the San Jose Sharks. This duo has just been so strong for them all season long. Onto the second line, however, we had Couture, Dzingel, and Noah Gregor, who joined the Couture and Dzingel on the second line, and it wasn't necessarily that great. Couture did hit a post early on in this game, but otherwise had a lot of issues, which is not necessarily that much of a surprise. Ended up finding himself on the ice a decent amount versus the Boston Bruins line of Pastrnak, Marchand, and Bergeron, and it's certainly no mistake that line is called the perfection line, right? Perfection is actually a very apt word for those three players who are just absolutely fantastic, potentially the best line in the NHL. You could very well make that argument. Definitely a top three line. And so when you're also flanked by Gregor and Dzingel, who certainly aren't terrible players, but aren't necessarily anywhere near the wingers that Bergeron has of Pastrnak and Marchand, you're likely going to have issues in that particular matchup. So even though this line did struggle, I don't necessarily blame them for that. On the third line, we had a small substitution as Bonino and Nieto were actually joined by Jonathan Dahlin, who was supposed to be a healthy scratch here tonight in favor of Andrew Cogliano, but at the very last minute, Cogliano drew out of the lineup for personal reasons, so Dahlin was given an opportunity here tonight. I wasn't particularly happy with the fact that the news came out that he was going to be a healthy scratch. I continue to look at this lineup, and I continue to see players like Viel and Gadjevich, and I know Bob Booner loves to say the fact that those players fill their role perfectly fine. Oh, they do the enforcer, and look how Viel heroically decided to fight Zdeno Chara last game. But the fact of the matter is that if you're going to try to make the playoffs, the way to win hockey games is by actually scoring goals, and I would put a bit more faith into Jonathan Dahlin to be able to score those goals compared to both Gadjevich and Viel, who have combined for less than half of the goals, for less than almost a quarter of the goals, I believe, actually, that Dahlin has scored this season. But he ends up in the line up on this third line, doesn't necessarily do much of anything, to say the least. But again, it is against the Bruins. You're not with super reliable line mates. Bonino has not been particularly good this season, at least on the offensive side of things, and also on the defensive side of things. Generally, he's had a pretty rough go of it this year, and the same could be said about Matt Nieto. So again, it's the product of Dahlin not really being a line driver. He's not a player who is so good that he's able to just absolutely be an offensive force on his own line like a Timo Meier could potentially be. Dahlin will benefit from better line mates, and that's just not really something that he's getting here in this game, so not a surprise that he doesn't do much. And on to the fourth line, Weatherby, Gadjevich, and Viel did have a couple of chances. Credit where credit is due there. Gadjevich had a couple of decent breaks, and Weatherby had that one opportunity, which was nice to see. But otherwise not anything blow me away from the fourth line, but certainly better than they usually are. On to the defensive side of things, we have Middleton and Burns, and Brent Burns is always the defenseman to talk about, certainly because of the fact that he has just been so incredibly inconsistent this season. He's had times where he's looked very solid. I remember there was that early stretch in the season where it was a question of, after he had put up so many points, could he potentially be in a Norris conversation at his age? But that has gone completely out the window over these past 30 or even 40 games at this point, and it continues to be the case. Brent Burns getting abused in the defensive zone. Again, hard to be super mad at him for that, just because he was against that perfection line a lot. Pastrnak, Marchand, and Bergeron are very, 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 very good players, and Brent Burns is not necessarily the best in the defensive zone. So when you combine those two things, Brent Burns is going to look pretty bad in tonight's game. He did have that very heroic, or not really heroic because it didn't actually amount to a goal in the end, but he had a very, very nice play, very strong play in that third period where he walks around a couple of Bruins players to get a decent chance on net. It doesn't end up being a goal, but those are the things that we can occasionally see out of Brent Burns, which is why he continues to merit a spot in the lineup and getting, decent minutes. And here tonight, even with Mario Ferraro going down, which I will get to a bit later, at the very least, he did not get the 30 minutes that he had in the previous game. This could be because Ferraro went down with an injury much later in the game than Milosh did. Ferraro was about halfway through, while Milosh was still at some point in the first period last game. Brent Burns still ended up with still a lot, but at least slightly more manageable 26 minutes here tonight. On the second pairing, Ferraro ends up getting matched with Merkley because Miloš was injured here tonight, so Šimek and Vlasic were the Sharks' third pairing. And I'll first mention Mario Ferraro, like I said, went down with an injury about halfway through the second period. A pretty dirty play, you could say, a bit sneaky dirty play from Taylor Hall, who's not necessarily known to be an extremely dirty player, so I doubt it was anything intentional. It is a question of whether or not there would be some suspension. Obviously, there was this injury to Mario Ferraro, and it looks relatively serious, though of course I am not a doctor. But as we know, the history and the track record with the Sharks, very, very, very few players, and basically none as of late over these past few years, have actually been suspended for plays committed against the San Jose Sharks. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Taylor Hall suit up for the Bruins next game. But on to his defensive partner, that was Ryan Merkley here tonight. He played about 17 minutes, so a bit more than he played last game in that 5 defenseman situation as well. And I thought Merkley was potentially the Sharks' best defenseman, and also, you could say one of their best players in general. Merkley set up a few nice offensive plays, had that very nice play for himself in the last few minutes of that third period that eventually got a great chance on net. It almost squeaked through Swayman. Then he managed to recover the puck out of the scrum in front, sent a nice pass to Tomas Hertl, who somehow ended up missing the pretty wide open net, ended up shooting it directly into Swayman. So that was pretty disappointing to see, as that probably should have been the game-tying goal thanks to the efforts of Ryan Merkley. But in the end, it didn't matter. But it was nice to see that Ryan Merkley was not only building confidence at the even strength level, as he also, earlier on in that play, walked around his man at the blue line, but we also saw a bit of a buildup of confidence on the power play for Ryan Merkley as well. So that was very nice to see. Merkley has actually begun to develop into a pretty solid defenseman, and as long as Bob Booner doesn't stick his foot in his own mouth and get in the way of that development, it's possible that by the end of this season, Ryan Merkley could be a solid or a relatively solid top 4 defenseman, though we'll see once players are healthier, once Ferraro does return, if that does happen, once Erik Karlsson does return, once, if Knyzhov maybe does return, if that does at some point actually happen, if Ryan Merkley can even maintain a lineup spot with the sort of interesting relationship that Booner and Merkley for some reason do have. And then when it comes to Vlasic and Šimek, not a terrible game for themselves, obviously not really getting the brunt of the matchups here tonight. Vlasic, I remember from many years ago at this point, he would be the one facing off against the perfection line of Pastrnak, or this might have even been potentially before the Bruins even had Pastrnak, but still, Bergeron and Marchand. But now these are the days where he's up against the third line, where he faces off against the players like Craig Smith or Charlie Coyle, and he did a decent enough job at that. And finally, onto the goaltender. That is, of course, James Reimer here. Once again, put up in a very, very solid performance here tonight. Can't necessarily blame him on many of these goals. A lot of them were just off of extremely pretty passing plays between the Boston Bruins players, between their 3 best players. And so Reimer certainly did his best job at trying to keep the Sharks in this game. It just didn't end up being enough. But the major issue, I would say, is that the Sharks actually do play again tomorrow, and that is against the Seattle Kraken. And it seems as though the word out of Bob Booner is that since Adin Hill still will not be back from whatever injury he is dealing with, that James Reimer will get a second straight start. Now, I realize he did have the massive break for the Olympic break, but I've been talking about this a lot, that Reimer seems like it would do a bit of benefit to him to get a night off and be able to sit on the bench and just watch the game unfold in front of him. And I don't think starting a Zachary Sawchenko against a team like the Seattle Kraken when the Sharks are this far out of a playoff spot is going to be the end of the season, the end of the world for the San Jose Sharks, but it seems as though that is indeed the case, and so I suspect we see Reimer again tomorrow. Class dismissed.